Ask most people why Nike fell apart, and you'll get an answer within about 5 seconds. They'll say Nike lost touch. They'll say Gen Z stopped caring about the swoosh, that Hoka and On just made cooler shoes, that the culture moved on the way culture always eventually moves on from anything that gets too big, too corporate, too safe. It's a comfortable story. It's also mostly wrong. Because here's what actually happened. In June of 2017, Nike's own leadership walked into the offices of thousands of retail partners. Companies like Foot Locker, DSW, Zappos, independent specialty running shops that had carried Nike product for decades, and told them, in effect, that they weren't needed anymore. The world was going direct to consumer, Nike said, and going forward, the company would concentrate on a small handful of strategic partners. Everyone else could find another supplier. This wasn't a company getting outcompeted. This was a company voluntarily walking away from the exact relationships that had put its shoes on shelves and in front of customers for 40 years, and handing that shelf space, gift-wrapped, to two much smaller competitors who were more than happy to take it. 7 years later, the math on that decision came due. The CEO who oversaw it was fired. The stock lost over $100 billion in market capitalization. And Nike, the company that didn't just dominate the sneaker category, but essentially invented the modern version of it, found itself begging back the same retailers it had shown the door. This is the true history of Nike, not a story about a company that got uncool. A story about a company that quietly stopped paying attention to the machinery underneath its own success and mistook a decade of momentum for permanent immunity from its own mistakes. To understand how a company that big could make a mistake that basic, you have to go back to where the whole thing started. A 26-year-old accountant, a pair of Japanese running shoes, and a business built on something close to nothing. The year is 1964. Phil Knight is a 26-year-old accountant with a theory nobody in the American running shoe business wanted to hear: that the German-made shoes dominating the market could be beaten by cheaper, better-made shoes coming out of Japan. Knight flies to Japan, walks into the offices of a company called Onitsuka Tiger, and talks his way into distribution rights for the United States. He doesn't have a store. He doesn't have a warehouse. He sells the shoes out of the trunk of his car at track meets, one pair at a time, to runners who'd never heard of the brand. His partner in this is a man named Bill Bowerman, a legendary track coach who is, by every account, borderline obsessed with shaving weight and friction out of a running shoe. Bowerman is the guy who pours rubber into a waffle iron in his kitchen trying to create a better outsole, an experiment that becomes, almost by accident, one of the most recognizable shoe treads in history. Even the logo is built on almost nothing. Knight pays a graphite student $35 to design a swoosh. Years later, he gives her 500 shares of company stock as a thank you, shares that, had she held onto them, would be worth roughly $10 million today. That's the entire origin story in miniature. A scrappy, undercapitalized operation that kept winning by simply outworking and outcaring about the product more than anyone assumed a shoe company needed to. Through the 70s and into the 80s, that formula works. But by the mid-1980s, something happens that should have become a permanent lesson inside the company and instead got filed away as a near-miss story people told at company meetings. Nike got comfortable, big, established, confident, and while it was busy being big, established, and confident, an entirely different cultural wave was building outside its walls: aerobics. Reebok rode that wave hard, and for a stretch in the mid-80s, Nike's market share actually dropped below competitors for a category the company hadn't even seen coming. Phil Knight, who had stepped back from day-to-day leadership, had to come back in and personally right the ship. The lesson embedded in that moment is simple. and it's one you'll see repeat constantly across companies that eventually collapse. Culture and customer behavior shift outside your building whether you're watching or not, and if you're too busy admiring your own dominance to notice the shift, it will cost you real market share before you even register that something changed. It's worth pausing on how close that moment actually came to being terminal for the company. Reebok wasn't a scrappy startup nipping at Nike's heels. For a stretch in the mid-1980s, Reebok actually outsold Nike in the United States, driven almost entirely by a category Nike's leadership had dismissed as a fad. Aerobics wasn't real athletics, in the internal logic of a company built by serious track coaches and competitive runners. That dismissal is exactly what let Reebok build an entire customer base, largely women, largely underserved by a running shoe-obsessed Nike, before Nike's leadership even acknowledged the category was worth taking seriously. The company that had built itself on paying obsessive attention to what athletes actually needed had, within roughly 2 decades, developed a blind spot for an entire class of customer standing directly in front of it. Nike survived that one. The save came from an unlikely direction. A rookie basketball player named Michael Jordan signed to a shoe deal in 1984, wearing a custom shoe so aggressively individual that the NBA fined him $5,000 every single game he wore it. The controversy did more marketing work than any ad campaign could have. Nike had projected $3 million in first-year Air Jordan sales. They did $126 million. By 1988, Nike had figured out something most of its competitors hadn't. It wasn't just selling shoes anymore, it was selling identity. Just Do It launched that year, and by the 1990s, virtually every major athlete worth sponsoring, Bo Jackson, Charles Barkley, Carl Lewis, was wearing a swoosh and cashing a Nike check. It was a genuinely symbiotic relationship. Nike got cultural relevance manufactured through the most credible people on earth to manufacture it, and those athletes got paid more than any endorsement deal had paid before. By the 1990s, the strategy had matured into something close to a formula. Identify the athletes with the most cultural gravity in any given sport, sign them before competitors recognize their value, and let the athlete's performance do the marketing work no ad agency could manufacture on its own. It worked because Nike's leadership at the time had genuine hands-on knowledge of the sports they were selling into, people who had coached, run, played, and understood what actually mattered to the athletes they were signing, not just what looked good in a boardroom pitch. That depth of category knowledge is easy to take for granted when it's present, and, as this story eventually shows, catastrophic to lose without noticing. Phil Knight stepped back from the CEO role in 2003. Over the following 2 decades, under a series of different leaders, revenue would climb from roughly $10 billion a year to over $44 billion. And that's precisely the environment where the next mistake started to take root. Not a market Nike was losing, but a company so large, so dominant, so used to winning, that leadership stopped questioning whether the machine underneath the growth was still healthy. If you've never seen Nike's headquarters in Oregon, it's worth understanding what it actually looks like. Manicured, sprawling, closer to a private university campus than a corporate office park. It's the kind of environment where you could work every single day, watch the revenue numbers keep climbing, and develop a genuinely distorted sense of how invincible the business actually was. That distortion is the exact soil the next decision grew out of. In June of 2017, Nike announced a strategic initiative called Consumer Direct Offense. The pitch, internally, was straightforward and, on paper, genuinely reasonable. E-commerce was exploding. Digital sales were growing 30% year over year, and customers who bought directly from Nike online were spending roughly 4 times what a walk-in customer at a third-party retailer spent. Why keep splitting margin with wholesale partners when the company could sell directly to the customer, capture the full margin, and control the entire brand experience. Nike's internal models showed the math working beautifully. By cutting out wholesale retailers, the company calculated it would capture roughly 6 percentage points of additional margin per sale. That number went straight into the strategy deck. It looked like free money. Except it wasn't free. And it wasn't even accurate, because the model left out two enormous costs that only show up once you're actually the retailer instead of the manufacturer. The first was the cost every e-commerce operator eventually learns the hard way: returns, chargebacks, and disputes, which typically run around 4% of revenue for a direct retailer. Wholesale partners had always absorbed that cost as part of running their own storefronts. The moment Nike became its own retailer, that 4% became Nike's problem, eating most of the margin gain the model had promised. The second cost was even bigger, and it exposed a much deeper misunderstanding about how direct-to-consumer actually works. When a customer walks into a Foot Locker, Nike doesn't have to pay to get that customer through the door. Foot Locker does, through location, foot traffic, and decades of brand building of its own. When Nike sells directly, Nike has to manufacture that foot traffic itself, and in the modern internet, there are really only two places to do that at scale: Meta and Google. Between 80 and 90% of all online advertising spend in the United States runs through those two companies. And between 2020 and 2023, the cost of buying attention on those platforms climbed sharply. Nike wasn't just losing the 4% in operational overhead, it was now paying, out of its own pocket, for the exact customer discovery that wholesale partners had previously provided for free, bundled into. There was a third piece of the old arrangement. Nike's leadership seems to have badly underweighted: inventory risk. When Foot Locker buys Nike shoes wholesale, Foot Locker is spending its own capital to take on that inventory, and Foot Locker eats the loss if a particular shoe doesn't sell. Nike gets paid immediately, up front, and the downside risk sits entirely with the retailer. The moment Nike goes direct, that risk transfers entirely onto Nike's own balance sheet. If a shoe doesn't move, that's now Nike's problem, Nike's markdown, Nike's write-off. None of these costs were hidden or exotic. They were the ordinary, well-understood economics of retail. But a spreadsheet, built by executives who had spent their careers on the manufacturing and brand side of the business, not the retail side, simply didn't have line items for them. The model wasn't fraudulent. It was just missing a category, and missing categories in a spreadsheet is exactly how "we're saving 6% quietly turns into a strategic mistake nobody notices until years later. There's an important distinction buried in that gap, and it's the same distinction that explains why so many manufacturing and consumer brands eventually stumble the same way Nike did. A company that makes a great product and a company that runs a great retail operation are fundamentally different businesses, requiring different expertise, different capital structures, and a completely different tolerance for risk. Nike had spent 50 years becoming exceptional at the first thing. Consumer direct offense assumed that being exceptional at making shoes automatically transferred into being exceptional at selling them directly to millions of individual customers, absorbing their returns, managing their expectations, and carrying their inventory risk. Those skills don't transfer automatically, and the 6% margin model treated them as though they did. The system Nike broke wasn't just financial. Nike started systematically cutting ties with specialty running shops, the small independent stores that serve the most committed segment of the running population, the people training for marathons who show up wanting a fitting, a conversation, an actual recommendation instead of scrolling a website. That customer doesn't just buy a shoe. That customer influences dozens of other people, because humans, as social animals, look to people who appear faster and more knowledgeable than themselves when deciding what to buy. When the serious runners at a specialty shop start showing up to races wearing something other than Nike, that signals downstream, to every casual runner who watches them, that Nike may not be the brand for people who are serious about the sport. There's a compounding element to this dynamic that Nike's leadership seems to have underestimated entirely. Trust with a retail partner isn't something you can simply reactivate on demand once you've decided you need it back. A specialty running shop that spends years being told, implicitly, that it's not a strategic priority doesn't sit around waiting to be needed again. It goes and finds another supplier who treats the relationship as central rather than optional. Every year that passed after 2017 wasn't just a year of lost shelf space. It was a year of a competitor deepening exactly the kind of relationship Nike had just walked away from, making any eventual reversal that much harder to execute. Two much smaller competitors, Hoka and On, walked directly into the vacuum Nike had created. They went after exactly the specialty running shops Nike had abandoned, cultivated the elite and semi-elite runner segment Nike had stopped courting, and by the time casual runners started noticing what serious runners were wearing, Hoka and On were already the answer, because they were already sitting on the shelf Nike had voluntarily vacated. The results of that strategic bet show up clearly, and they show up fast. Hoka's revenue climbed from $400 million in 2018 to $1.8 billion by 2023. On's revenue over the same window went from $250 million to $1.7 billion, growing even faster than Hoka in percentage terms. Nike's overall share of the running category fell from 34% to 26%. Among the highest-end runners, the exact demographic that sets trends for everyone else, Nike's share collapsed from 66% down to under 34%, cut by more than half. Meanwhile, the excess inventory that direct-to-consumers risk transfer created had to go somewhere, and Nike started routing it into discount channels, TJ Maxx, and similar off-price retailers, moving product at steep markdowns just to clear it. That's a dangerous move for any premium brand, because a brand that once commanded full price starts training its own customer base to wait for a discount instead, which erodes the pricing power that made the brand premium in the first place. It's a slow, self-reinforcing spiral. Markdowns train customers to expect markdowns, which makes the brand less premium, which requires more markdowns to move product, which makes the brand less premium again. In 2020, Nike brought in a new CEO named John Donahoe, whose background was in eBay and ServiceNow, enterprise technology and digital transformation, not athletic footwear, not sports culture, not retail. Under Donahoe, Nike underwent a significant structural reorganization, moving away from the sport-specific divisions that had defined the company for decades. A basketball division, a running division, a kids division, each staffed by people who had spent their careers immersed in that specific sports culture and customer, toward a structure organized around broad customer segments: men, women, kids. That change sounds like a minor org chart adjustment. It wasn't. The old structure meant a small group of people inside Nike understood basketball culture at a granular level, another group understood serious distance running at a granular level, and so on. Once those specialists were diffused across broader demographic categories, nobody inside the company was specifically responsible for deeply understanding what a competitive marathon runner actually wanted from a shoe. The institutional expertise that used to catch a problem like the running category collapse before it became a 5-year trend simply wasn't concentrated anywhere anymore. This is, in a very real sense, the same failure mode that nearly sank the company in the 1980s against Reebok, just wearing a different costume. In the 80s, Nike missed a cultural shift because leadership was too confident in the existing formula to look outward. In the 2010s, Nike missed a category collapse because leadership had just restructured away the internal people whose entire job was to look outward on the company's behalf. The company had, decades earlier, learned the hard way what happens when nobody's specifically watching a given sports culture. Then it rebuilt its own organization in a way that recreated exactly that blind spot, this time by design rather than by accident. The product pipeline reflected the drift. 2017, the same year Consumer Direct Offense launched, was the last year Nike released what most in the industry consider a genuinely innovative running shoe, the Vaporfly. After that, the company leaned heavily into retro releases, old Air Jordan silhouettes, classic dunks, products that traded on nostalgia rather than new performance innovation. It's a pattern familiar from other industries entering decline, leaning on the back catalog because the back catalog is safe, instead of investing in the next genuinely new thing. That pattern shows up starkly in the numbers. Between 2019 and 2023, Nike spent $18 billion on stock buybacks, a move that boosts the stock price and shareholder returns in the short term, and only $11 billion on research and development, the actual investment that produces new product innovation. Over that same stretch, Hoka and On were releasing new models at a pace that felt, to their customers, like continuous innovation, while Nike was largely repackaging old wins. One designer inside the company at the time put it about as bluntly as you can. Nike had gone from being an athletic company that happened to have good marketing to a marketing company that happened to still sell shoes. Stock buybacks aren't inherently a warning sign. Plenty of healthy, well-run companies use them as a routine way to return capital to shareholders. What makes Nike's buyback spending notable in this context is the specific trade-off it represents during exactly the years the company needed product innovation most. Every dollar spent repurchasing shares is a dollar not spent developing the next Vaporfly, not spent on the R&D that keeps a performance brand credible with the exact serious runner segment it was actively losing to Hoka and On. Viewed from a quarterly earnings call, buybacks look like financial discipline. Viewed against a running category collapsing in real time, they look like a company choosing to reward shareholders today over remaining competitive tomorrow, a trade-off that's only visible in hindsight once the tomorrow it mortgaged has actually arrived. And there was one more almost embarrassingly basic misjudgment buried inside the direct-to-consumer bet. Nike assumed the future of shoe buying was people clicking a button online and having the right shoe simply show up. Most people don't buy shoes that way. Feet are individually shaped, sizes run inconsistently across brands, and most customers still want to physically try a shoe on before spending money on it. There's an old story from World War II about military engineers designing a single, average cockpit seat based on the average measurements of thousands of pilots, and discovering that the average-sized seat fit almost nobody, because no individual pilot actually matched the average across every dimension simultaneously. Shoes work the same way. Nike had built an entire strategic bet on the assumption that its customers would behave like an aggregate average, and most real customers didn't. By this point, the company was still large, still generating tens of billions in revenue, still, on the surface, a $50 billion business. But underneath the top-line numbers, the foundation the company had spent decades building, deep retail relationships, category-leading innovation, institutional expertise inside every sport it competed in, had been quietly hollowed out, one individually defensible decision at a time. The specialty running channel is worth returning to here, because it illustrates just how narrow the window for correcting course actually was. Hoka and On didn't outmarket Nike in any conventional sense. For years, both companies spent a fraction of what Nike spent on advertising. What they did instead was show up, in person, at the exact stores and races Nike had walked away from, and let word of mouth among serious runners do the work Nike's ad budget used to do. By the time Nike's leadership recognized what was happening in the running category specifically, Hoka and On weren't emerging competitors anymore. They were the established default for an entire generation of new runners who had never had a reason to consider Nike in the first place. The company wasn't just losing market share. It was losing the specific customer segment most likely to influence everyone below them. The collapse became visible to the outside world on June 28, 2024. Nike went to the public markets and told analysts its future earnings outlook looked weak, warning of double-digit sales declines in North America, the company's largest market. The stock dropped 20% in a single trading day, wiping out roughly $28 billion in market value in a matter of hours. Inside the company, leadership began scrambling to rebuild exactly the relationships they'd severed 7 years earlier, reaching back out to the wholesale retailers and specialty running shops that consumer direct defense had cut loose. But those retailers had already been burned once, had already rebuilt their businesses around Hoka and On, and weren't eager to sign up for a second round of whatever Nike decided direct-to-consumer meant next. The specialty running shops in particular had no reason to walk away from partners who were, by that point, simply performing better for them. In September of 2024, Nike's board fired John Donahoe and brought back Elliott Hill, a 32-year Nike veteran who had retired 4 years earlier. That move follows a pattern that shows up repeatedly when a board brings back someone from a company's earlier era. It's a public admission that the company needs to return to fundamentals it drifted away from, not simply refine its current strategy. Boards rarely reach for a veteran insider when they believe the current strategic direction is basically sound and just needs better execution. They reach for that person specifically when they've concluded the direction itself was the problem, and they want someone who remembers what the company looked like before that direction was chosen. It's worth noting what Hill actually did in his first months back, because it tells you which of Nike's mistakes leadership considered most urgent to reverse. He didn't announce a bold new digital strategy or a splashy rebrand. He went back to sport-specific teams, restoring dedicated leadership for categories like running and basketball. He publicly recommitted to rebuilding wholesale relationships, acknowledging that the retail partners Nike had spent years pushing away were essential to reaching the customers Nike had lost. In other words, the fix wasn't a new idea. It was largely an attempt to undo the two structural decisions, the reorg and the wholesale exodus, that this story has spent the last several minutes unpacking. Hill's first earnings call as CEO was, by corporate standards, unusually blunt. New CEOs taking over from a predecessor whose strategy failed have every incentive to set expectations low rather than paint an optimistic picture, and Hill did exactly that, acknowledging directly that the company had suffered unacceptable losses in market share and needed to return to fundamentals. Under Donahoe's tenure, Nike's stock had fallen nearly 50%, and over $100 billion in market capitalization had been erased. Phil Knight, the man who started this entire company with a car trunk full of Japanese running shoes, was 87 years old by the time a reporter asked him, in 2023, what he thought Nike should do about the situation. His answer was 2 words. It's complicated. It is complicated, but it's not mysterious. And the popular explanation, that Nike simply got uncool, that a younger generation moved on the way generations always eventually move on from established brands, misses almost everything that actually happened. Nike didn't lose a culture war. Nike ran a strategic bet built on an incomplete spreadsheet, cut ties with the exact relationships that had built its dominance in the first place, and then spent the better part of a decade discovering, one bad quarter at a time, everything that Spreadsheet had failed to account for. There's a broader pattern buried in this story, and it's the same pattern that shows up whenever a company this size collapses this fast. Nobody at Nike woke up one morning and decided to destroy the company. A strategy team built a direct-to-consumer model that genuinely looked profitable on paper. A leadership team reorganized around customer segments because it looked, from the outside, like a more modern, more efficient structure. Executives approved stock buybacks because that's what shareholders were rewarding in the moment. Each of those decisions, evaluated in isolation, was defensible. It's only in aggregate, compounding quietly for the better part of a decade, that they produced a company that had optimized itself into a $100 billion collapse. That's the part worth sitting with. Nike didn't stop paying attention to its customers because leadership stopped caring about customers. It stopped paying attention because it started optimizing for a metric, direct-to-consumer revenue as a percentage of total sales, that used to correlate reasonably well with overall business health, and then quietly stopped correlating, without anyone noticing the gap had opened up until the gap had become enormous. The scoreboard kept climbing. The actual foundation underneath the scoreboard was eroding the entire time. Great businesses stay great by remembering, constantly and structurally, that the customer is the one who actually decides where their money goes, not the internal spreadsheet, not the quarterly earnings call, not the version of reality that looks good from inside a beautifully manicured corporate campus in Oregon. Nike forgot that for the better part of a decade. The company that essentially invented the modern sneaker industry, that turned Michael Jordan into a billion-dollar shoe deal, that built one of the most recognizable logos on the planet out of $35 and a good idea, spent 10 years mistaking its own internal metrics for the actual health of its business, and by the time the gap became impossible to ignore, the retailers it needed to win back had already moved on. That's the true history of Nike, not a company that lost its edge, a company that built a scoreboard, optimized relentlessly for the scoreboard, and never noticed the scoreboard had stopped measuring the thing that actually mattered. There's a version of this story that ends differently, and it's worth naming, because Nike still has advantages almost no competitor on earth can claim. Decades of brand equity, manufacturing scale most rivals will never reach, a roster of athlete relationships built over half a century. None of that disappeared in 2017, and none of it disappeared in the crash of 2024. What disappeared was the discipline to keep checking whether the internal metrics the company was chasing still matched what was actually happening to the people buying its shoes. That discipline is rebuildable. Whether Nike rebuilds it, or simply rides its remaining brand equity until the next spreadsheet mistake catches up with it, is the only part of this story that hasn't been written yet.